The woman at the front desk told her she could not be seen without proof of private insurance. She said it loudly enough that the two people in the waiting room looked up from their phones. Adeze Nwosu stood at that desk in a green linen dress she had pressed that morning. 33 years old, 104 pounds, because she had been giving her lunch to her daughter for the past 4 months and calling it a diet. And she held her daughter's hand and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, quietly, that her daughter had been vomiting since Thursday and had not held food for 2 days. The woman at the desk said she understood that, but the policy was the policy. She slid a laminated sheet across the counter. Adeze looked at the sheet. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the woman behind the desk, whose name tag said Blessing, and she said, "She is 7 years old." Blessing said, "Ma'am, there is a public clinic on Kofi Biako Road, 3 kilometers from here." She did not look up when she said it. She had already turned back to her screen. What Adeze did not know, standing at that desk at 9:22 in the morning on a Thursday in Accra, was that the man in room 14 of this same clinic, 2 corridors and a locked door away from her, had been looking for her for 11 years. Not with a detective. Not with money, though he had money. With guilt, with the specific, relentless guilt of a man who had been given a second life by someone he never properly thanked, whose name he had written down on the back of a hospital discharge form and carried in his wallet until the paper fell apart, and who had spent the years since replacing it with a printout. Then a phone note. Then a folded business card with her name written in his own handwriting so he would not lose it again. His name was Kwadwo Owusu Boateng, and he was the stranger. Adeze Nkechi Nwosu had grown up in the Adabraka neighborhood of Accra in a house that smelled of coal pot smoke and her grandmother's camphor oil. She was the second of 4 children, the only one who had followed her mother into nursing, and she had done it not for the title, but because she had a specific, uncommon capacity for sitting still beside suffering people without needing to fix the silence. Her supervisor at Korle-Bu Teaching Hospital had written in her 3rd-year evaluation that Adeze Nwosu had the rarest quality in medicine. She made sick people feel less alone simply by being present. She had read that sentence and folded the paper in 4ths and put it in the same small leather purse her mother had given her in 2009. Brown, with a brass clasp, shaped like a leaf, stitched by hand in a market stall on Abasi Okai Road. She had carried that purse every day for 15 years. She was 5'4" and had the posture of someone who had been told to stand straight so many times it had become involuntary. She wore her hair natural, pulled back with a yellow cloth tie on workdays and loose on Sundays. Her hands were a nurse's hands. She had learned to give injections so gently that patients sometimes asked if she had done it yet. She had been told she was beautiful in the general way people say it, but the detail that stayed with people was not her face. It was that she listened to you with her whole body turned toward you, as though your words were the only thing happening in the room. She had been a single mother for 3 years by the time she left Korle-Bu. Her daughter Maame was 4 when Adeze moved them into a 2-room apartment on Zorwulu Road that had a broken ceiling fan and a landlord who fixed nothing but charged on time. She had left the hospital not because of failure, but because of money. A private clinic in East Legon had offered her a staff nursing position at 2.4 times her salary. And the ceiling fan was still broken, and Mame's school fees were due in 40 days. She had taken the job without celebrating it. She had simply moved her uniform and her brown leather purse and the framed photograph of her mother from one locker to another. And she had started the next morning. That had been 8 months ago. She was making more money now, but only barely more money, because the private clinic had deducted uniform costs and training fees she had not been told about in the contract, and the rent on the Zorwulu apartment had gone up 6 weeks after she signed the lease extension. She had not told her sister. She had not told anyone at the new clinic. She managed the numbers the way she had been managing difficult things her entire adult life, alone, carefully, with the ledger kept in a small orange notebook in the kitchen drawer that she updated every Sunday night with a pencil and a ruler, and the same deliberateness her mother had used to balance the household accounts on a tin biscuit tray in the Atabraca house when Adeyeze was 10 years old. She had told no one about the lunches. She had told no one about the coin she kept in the left pocket of her work dress, worn smooth on one side, a 50 pesewa piece her grandmother had pressed into her hand in 2007 and said was not for spending. She pressed it now, at that front desk, while Blessing explained the Kofi Baako Road Clinic for the second time. Mame had first gotten sick on the previous Saturday. She had come home from school with a low fever that Adeyeze treated with paracetamol and ginger water and an extra blanket. Because she had treated hundreds of children, and she knew the difference between a fever that needed a hospital and a fever that needed a mother. By Monday it was better. By Wednesday, it was not. By Thursday morning, Mame could not keep water in her stomach, and her lips were dry, and she sat at the breakfast table and looked at her bowl without reaching for it, which was the sign Adeyeze had been watching for. A child who stopped reaching for food was a child who needed more than ginger water. She had spent 45 minutes that morning calling 3 different clinics before she found one that could see a walk-in pediatric case before noon. She had taken 2 buses and walked 6 blocks in the October heat with Mame's bag on her shoulder and Mame's hand in her hand, and arrived at the East Legan Clinic at 9:09 a.m. 13 minutes before Blessing told her she could not be seen without proof of private insurance. Adeyeze picked up her daughter's bag. She took Mame's hand. She walked back to the front entrance, pushed open the glass door, and stood on the step in the morning heat. Mame was watching her with the particular quiet of a child who had learned to read a parent's face for danger. Adeyeze looked down at her and said, "Let's get water first." She said it the way she always said difficult things, as if it were the most ordinary sentence in the world. She bought a sachet of water from a boy at a table near the gate and gave it to Mame and watched her drink it in 3 careful pulls. Then, she took out her phone and looked up Kofi Baako Road on the map. It was 2.8 kilometers. They had already walked 6 blocks to get here. Mamam had not eaten since the night before. Adeyeze looked at the map for a moment, then put the phone in her purse next to the worn coin and the brown leather strap and said, "We'll take a taxi." She had 34 Ghana cedis in her wallet. The taxi would be 12. The Kofi Baako Road Clinic had a waiting room with 14 plastic chairs and a ceiling fan that worked, and a window propped open with a piece of wood. The nurse at the triage desk was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, who looked at Mom with the efficient tenderness of someone who had seen 10 sick children already that morning. She said the wait would be about an hour, maybe an hour and 20 minutes. She said they could sit. She did not say it like a policy. She just said it. They sat. The room smelled of antiseptic and the faint sweetness of the mango juice someone had left open on the window ledge. Mom leaned against Adeyeze's arm and closed her eyes. The fan turned above them, slow and loud, clicking every 4th rotation at a piece of the housing that had come loose. Adeyeze watched it. She counted the rotations the way she counted things when she was managing something difficult. Not because the counting helped, but because it gave her mind somewhere specific to go. At 10:47, a woman came out from one of the back rooms and stood in the doorway and said her child was not responding well, and she needed a pediatric doctor. And the nurse at the triage desk said the pediatric doctor was not in on Thursdays. He came on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The woman said she had been told Thursdays. The nurse said she was sorry That must have been a miscommunication. There was a general practitioner on duty who could see the child. The woman's voice went very quiet and very controlled, in the way of someone who has learned that being loud in institutions accomplishes nothing. She said, "Can the general practitioner treat a 3-year-old with respiratory symptoms?" The nurse said she believed so. She said she would check. Adaise watched this. She had done triage. She knew the specific arithmetic of a public clinic on a Thursday morning. 1 GP, 14 chairs, a ceiling fan with a loose housing. She understood it without judgment. The system was not cruel. It was just exactly as full as it looked. Mom opened her eyes and said she was thirsty again. Adaise gave her the second sachet from her bag. She had brought 3. She pressed her thumb to the worn side of the 50 Pasewa coin through the fabric of her pocket and thought about the ledger in the kitchen drawer and the red column she had been keeping from the blue column since April, and the number that separated them, which was not large enough to justify fear, but not small enough to ignore. She had been sitting in the Kofi Bako Road waiting room for 38 minutes when her phone rang. The number was an East Legon prefix she did not recognize. She almost did not answer. Then, she answered. The voice on the other end was young and slightly out of breath, and said his name was Emmanuel. He was a junior nurse at the East Legon private clinic, and he was calling because there was a patient who had asked specifically to speak with a woman matching her description who had been at the front desk that morning. He said the patient had said her name before Emmanuel had said anything. He said he had found her number through the referral slip Adaise had filled in at the triage window, which listed her as a clinic employee. He apologized for the method. He said the patient had asked him to. Adaise sat with the phone against her ear and looked at Mame, who was asleep against her arm. She said, "What is the patient's name?" Emmanuel said, "Kwadwo Owusu Boateng." She held the phone away from her ear for a moment and looked at nothing. The ceiling fan clicked above her on the 4th rotation. Then she said she would need 20 minutes. She was half a block from the East Legon clinic when Emmanuel came out at a half jog and said, She's here quietly to himself, not to her, before he saw her and stopped and said instead, more formally, "Thank you for coming back." She went in. The corridor to room 14 smelled of hand sanitizer and the faint sweetness of cleaning fluid. It was 9:38 in the morning. Mame walked with her hand in Adaise's, looking at everything. The door to room 14 was half open. Adaise stopped outside it. She could hear breathing. She pressed her hand flat against the wall for a moment, the way she did before difficult procedures, not for courage, but for centering. Then she pushed the door open. Kwadwo Owusu Boateng was sitting upright in the bed in a white hospital gown, connected to a blood pressure monitor and a drip, with the look of a man who had been expecting her and had not allowed himself to believe she would actually come. He was 48 years old, broad-shouldered and slightly thin in the way of people who had been sick long enough that their clothes fit differently than they used to. He had a neat close beard and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he was holding the folded business card in both hands. And when Adaise walked in, he looked at her the way people look at things they were afraid might not be real. He said her name. He said, Adaise Nkechi Nwosu. She stopped at the foot of the bed and looked at him for 3 full seconds. She did not recognize him. She had not expected to. It had been 11 years, and she had been 22 when it happened, and the hospital had told her almost nothing about the recipient, only that the surgery was successful, that the organ was viable, that the man had been given an extension she had made possible. She had donated the kidney quietly, without telling most people in her life, because one of her colleagues at the teaching hospital had mentioned a man in critical renal failure, listed and waiting, and Adaise had been tested as a compatibility candidate almost by accident. And when the results came back and the doctor had called her and said, gently, that she did not have to do this, she had said, "I know." And she had done it anyway. She had not heard from him. For 11 years she had not heard from him. She stood at the foot of that bed and held her daughter's hand and said nothing. He said, "I found your name at Corlebu 3 years ago. They told me you had left. I have been trying to find you. I have your letter, the one I wrote and could not deliver." He reached to the bedside table and picked up an envelope that was clearly not new. The corners had gone soft. He held it out to her, and his hand was not entirely steady. Adaize did not take it yet. She said, "Why are you here, in this clinic?" He said, "The kidney is failing. If this story is landing where I think it is, stay with me, because what happens in the next few minutes is the reason I needed to tell it from the beginning." The kidney had begun showing signs of chronic rejection 14 months earlier. He had been managing it with medication, then with more aggressive medication, then with the resignation of a man who had already been given more time than he expected and understood the accounting was coming due. His doctor at the clinic, a Dr. Asante Mensah, whom he had been seeing for 9 years, had him in for weekly monitoring. He was not in crisis. He was in the careful middle distance between stable and not stable, which is where the fear lives permanently. He had been in this clinic at 7:45 that morning for a standard blood draw when he had heard, through the corridor and the half-open door, a woman's voice saying the name, Kofi Biako Road. He had heard the specific patients in it, the way it controlled itself. He had asked Emmanuel, who was adjusting his drip line, what was happening at the front desk. Emmanuel had gone and looked and come back and said there was a woman with a little girl being turned away for insurance. Kwadwo had said, "What does she look like?" Emmanuel had described her. Kwadwo had said, "Her name is Adaize Nwosu. Go and ask if that's her name. Go now, before she leaves." Emmanuel had looked at him for a moment, then gone. Now she was here. She took the envelope. She did not open it. She held it flat in both hands and looked at it, and Mame leaned against her leg, and Adaize said, "Is there a doctor here who can see my daughter today?" Her voice was steady. She was not performing steadiness. She simply was. He said, "I will make sure of it." He reached for the call button. The doctor who came was not Blessing's supervisor. The doctor who came was Dr. Asante Mensah himself, who had been told by Emmanuel exactly what Room 14's patient had requested, and who had read the patient file for Room 14 closely enough to understand the weight of the request. He examined Ma'ame with the gentleness of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and still chose to narrate the examination in a quiet voice, so children knew what was coming. He said she had a moderate gastrointestinal infection, likely viral, manageable with oral rehydration and a short course of medication. He wrote the prescription himself. He told Adaize the clinic would not be billing for this visit. He said it like a statement of fact, not a concession, and left before she could respond. Adaize sat in the chair beside Kwadwo's bed for 47 minutes. Ma'ame fell asleep with her head on Adaize's lap within 15 minutes, the sleep of a child who had been sick and is now somewhere warm and quiet with her mother's hand in her hair. Adaize opened the envelope. The letter inside was 4 pages, handwritten in a small, controlled script, dated June 3, 2014. She read it without speaking. She read it the way she listened to patients, whole body toward it. Nothing else in the room. It began with his name and his age at the time of the surgery, 37, 2 children under 10, a business he had built over 12 years in import logistics in Tema, a wife named Constance, who had sat in the hospital for 9 days and not left. It said that he had been on the list for 14 months before Adaize's compatibility result came through. It said that the surgeon had told him her name the morning of his transfer to the recovery ward, against protocol, because the surgeon had met Adaize and felt she deserved to be known to the person she had saved. It said he had tried to contact her through the hospital 3 times over the following 2 years and been told, correctly, that donor information was protected and could not be shared. It said, "I have been carrying your name for 11 years. I carried it because I did not want to forget what I was given. I carried it because my children are now 18 and 20, and both of them know your name. I carried it because every morning I wake up I understand that I am here because of a decision you made about a stranger, and I never found a way to make that small enough to set down." She folded the letter back into the envelope. She held it on her lap for a long time. Kwadwo said nothing. He understood what silence was for. Eventually she said, "How is Constance?" He smiled. It was the kind of smile that carries something behind it. He said, "She is in Kumasi this week. She will be very unhappy she missed today." Adaize looked down at Ma'am sleeping. She adjusted the cloth over her daughter's shoulder. She said, "Your kidney." He said, "The prognosis is careful, not urgent, but it requires management." She said, "Are you on the list?" He said, "I will not go on the list. I have already had more than I was supposed to have." He said it without drama, with the particular calm of a man who has negotiated a private peace with mortality and is not asking anyone else to share the weight of it. She said, "That is not your decision to make alone." He looked at her. She said, "You have children. You have a wife who drove 9 days to a hospital. You do not get to make that calculation alone and call it dignity." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are still a nurse." She said, "I have always been a nurse." He said, "Constance has been saying the same thing to me for 4 months. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. "I will speak with Dr. Mensah this week. Seriously." He paused. "I would like you to be there. If that is not strange." She considered it. She said, "It is a little strange." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'll be there." Ma'am woke up at 11:14. She looked at the man in the bed with the neutral curiosity of a 7-year-old who finds adults in rooms to be generally self-explanatory. She asked him what the machine next to him was for. He explained it carefully, in terms a 7-year-old could use. She listened, then said his machine beeped the same as the one in her class when the microwave finished. He looked at Adaize. Adaize pressed her lips together and said nothing. They left at 11:31. Adaize shook his hand at the door. He held it for a moment longer than a handshake and said, "Thank you. The first time, and this time." She said he was welcome, the first time and this time. And then she took Ma'am's hand and walked down the corridor and through the glass door and into the heat of the morning on Kwabenya Road, East Legon, with the prescription in her purse beside the brass-clasped leather bag her mother had given her and the 50 pesewa coin worn smooth on one side. And she did not look back. 3 weeks later, she sat in Dr. Mensah's office at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday with Kwadwo on her left and Constance Owusu Boateng on her right, a small woman in a yellow dress who took Adaize's hand when she was introduced and held it for a full 5 seconds and said, "I have wanted to meet you since 2013. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, Kwadwo had agreed to re-enter the evaluation process. Dr. Mensah had also asked, carefully, whether Adaize had ever considered clinic-based nursing coordination work. Because he had a patient management gap he had not been able to fill. She had said she would think about it. She went home, and she thought about it for one evening, and then she called him the next morning and said yes. 4 months after that, She was sitting at a desk in a small office on the second floor of the East Legon Clinic, 2 rooms from the ward where room 14 was, with her brown leather purse on the corner of the desk and a small framed photograph of Mom at her school concert beside it, coordinating patient care for 34 long-term chronic illness cases, earning a salary that covered the rent and the school fees and her own lunch. And sometimes on Thursday mornings she walked down the corridor and knocked on the door of whichever room Quadwo was in for his weekly monitoring, and Mame had started calling him Nana Quadwo, which he had accepted with the dignity of a man who understood he had not earned it, but was grateful to be given it anyway. She had not expected any of this. She had given the kidney at 22 because a man was dying, and she was compatible, and the decision had seemed, at the time, like the only logical conclusion of the facts. She had not given it for gratitude. She had not given it for connection. She had given it the way she did most things in her life, because something needed to be done, and she was the person standing there, and she knew how. The world does not always recognize what it is standing in the presence of. It turns away the woman at the front desk. It sends her to the public clinic 3 kilometers down the road. It does not ask her name or notice the coin worn smooth in her pocket, or the leather purse her mother stitched in a market stall, or the 11 years of lunches she gave away, or the part of herself she gave to a stranger on a surgical table in 2013 because the math of his survival required it. What she carried inside, the stillness, the hands that gave injections gently, the capacity to sit beside suffering without needing to fill the silence, none of that was visible from the front desk. None of it showed up in an insurance database. It could not be verified by a laminated sheet. The woman named Blessing had looked at the dress before the face and made the calculation most institutions make. Not enough. Not the right kind. Not here. But some things cannot be assessed from a counter. Some things only become visible over time. The way the value of what you give often appears years later in forms you never imagined when you were giving it. A door opening down a corridor you never expected to walk. A name spoken by a man who had been holding it for 11 years because he understood that some debts are not financial. They are human. They are the kind you carry, not because you owe them, but because carrying them is the only way to stay honest about who you are and what you were given. You cannot erase what a person carries inside their hands. You cannot send it to the public clinic down the road. You cannot reject it at the front desk. You can delay it. You can make it stand in the rain. You can hand it a laminated sheet and turn back to your screen. But the thing a person carries, the skill, the stillness, the willingness to give from themselves when someone else is running out, that does not go home when the door closes. It stays. It keeps moving. And one day, without announcement, it walks back through a door you thought you had closed, and it says your name. If you are watching this and there is someone in your life who gave you something they could not get back, their time, their energy, a sacrifice you may have never properly acknowledged, ask yourself, have you told them? Not with money, not with a gift. With the specific, direct sentence, I know what you gave me. I have been carrying it. Leave your answer in the comments. I want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.